Good evening, greetings, welcome to this episode of the Pandemic Podcast. Living with COVID, is it time to let go? Tonight, Boris Johnson announced the end of all COVID-19 restrictions in England as this pivotal moment marks what could be described as Freedom Day Part 2, having already been through this rigmarole before. Is it really time to let go? Will we truly begin to live with COVID as we've heard about before? Or is this just a new temporary pause in lieu of a future variant and a future emergency? In tonight's broadcast, I'm going to take you through the positive news in that, yes, indeed, Boris Johnson has confirmed that all restrictions will be lifted across the nation in England. Of course, this is whilst awaiting the outcome from a criminal probe by the Met Police into the alleged parties held by the government during the lockdown. But we won't be digressed by the politics of it all. We will focus on tonight the good news that all domestic restrictions will be removed. So I'm going to give you a recap of what's been announced today. I'll give you some analysis of the situation. I'll comment briefly on what's happening further afield around the rest of the world, because it's not just in England that we're seeing things begin to curl back. We're also seeing this in other parts of the world too. So first and foremost, all restrictions are ending. Free COVID testing to the general public will come to an end in England from the 1st of April, which marks the end of mass testing, certainly mass asymptomatic testing. Positive cases will no longer be required to self-isolate from as early as this Thursday. So anyone testing positive this week will have free reins to make their own personal choices based upon personal responsibility, an issue which has been hotly contested in the House of Commons today, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So self-isolation comes to an end, along with the support payments, which in itself is also another controversial issue based upon potential inequalities. It is worth noting, however, that those support payments are over and above the usual statutory sick pay that people may receive based upon their employers and other sick pay arrangements that employers may have in place. Nonetheless, which is unprecedented, of course, it's particular to the coronavirus. But nonetheless, there is reasonable concerns that some people now may be left behind. So despite that, the government will still advise that you stay home if you test positive up until the 1st of April. There was talk of becoming a bit more German, literally, in the Prime Minister's conference tonight, in the sense that the culture in Germany, I don't know why Germany was specifically used as a reference point, but nonetheless, it's understood that in Germany, people who are sick tend to take more time to rest rather than going into work, which actually I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I've often said that the culture we have in Britain, the kind of just get on with it type mentality has its benefits at times. But there are times when, you've been in the office, and I think we've all experienced it, when someone is absolutely riddled and you're doing a desperate best to avoid being spluttered on. So I think there is some merit to that idea that we should live more responsibly. But that, of course, should be a personal choice. But are we ready for a cultural shift in Britain? I don't know. But it's a valid point. So after the 1st of April, people will no longer be required to stay at home, and it's still only advisory now, as I mentioned. And the biggest testing program in the world is coming to an end. It cost England £2 billion in the last month alone to run the testing. And of course, when we hear the term that the free testing is coming to an end, it is somewhat laughable, because it's not actually free if you think about it. £2 billion spent last month, £15 billion per year on testing. That's tax money. So free at point of service, yes, but watch out for that increase in your tax bill as we go along. So yes, the free testing is coming to an end. Now, of course, that is in itself is controversial. People have become acclimatized to this idea that we simply test ourselves on a routine basis to make sure that we don't have an illness and pass it on to others. But notably, even at the very highest elements of the pandemic, the peak of positivity was around 1 to 2% of overall tests. In time, there was other times it's gone beyond that, but the average peak is around 1 to 2%, meaning that great deal of millions of tests are coming back negative. So it comes back to the idea that to test for something that you don't have is a very costly exercise. Now, if you've been watching the show for a period of time, you'll know that there's plenty of criticism around the virtue of the tests themselves, and specifically around asymptomatic testing being a flawed approach. And finally, glad to see the back of that approach. But for some are left now feeling vulnerable, and it's been very interesting to watch the reaction in the build-up to this episode, the build-up into Boris's Prime Minister announcement tonight, and indeed across the press in the build-up to today. Full stop. It seems that people feel very vulnerable, being left without restrictions, being left without testing, without mandates, because, of course, they've become entirely accustomed to this way of life. This notion of now living with a virus to many is alien, despite the fact that that is how we have lived our lives for the bulk of history. And this particular virus has had special focus over time, sometimes warranted, other times not. A large portion not warranted, particularly in the way this has been overinflated, over-aggrandized, and perpetually fear-mongered around. We've covered this extensively over the last 2 years. So make no bones about it. This last 2 years has not been normal by any stretch. And whilst today might mark a genuine Freedom Day, moving through all the restrictions, my immediate focus moved to how do we start to reverse engineer what's happened over the last 2 years to start to really unpick what went wrong and why the world descended into what I would describe as madness. But others, I think, would see the world differently, which is why so many people now feel like naked without testing. Some people have become so accustomed to testing every day, despite not being sick in any way, that they now will feel left feeling insecure. And that's a sad reality and a sad consequence of the way that this pandemic has been managed. But to continue, staff in children in education settings will no longer be required to test. The free asymptomatic testing will cease, as I mentioned, from the 1st of April. People will still be able to purchase tests, and those who are vulnerable and symptomatic will still have access to free testing as well. So it's not that the tests have completely disappeared, but certainly the mass testing is a thing of a past, thank goodness. As I mentioned, £2 billion it cost last month. On average, it cost over £600 per positive test. Businesses will now be liable to pay for any of their own COVID testing. And it was understood that Rishi Sunak today resisted pressure from Sajid Javid for more funding and a slower timetable for the ending of these arrangements. So the self-isolation laws, as I mentioned, have been axed as one of the many restrictions that have now disappeared. And of course, all the other restrictions such as COVID certification, vaccine certification, they're all a thing of the past now as well. Now, in terms of the way that the press conference was positioned, Boris Johnson was very cavalier, positively driving forward, saying this is time to move forward, paid homage to the fact that Britain is one of the first to do this, which I think is a real testament. Actually, that doesn't undermine the flaws that have gone before us, of course, but actually now Britain is charging a path. There are other countries dropping restrictions, but certainly Britain is leading the way here, certainly England leading the way. And Boris pointed out that despite having some restrictions, England has been one of the most open nations in the world over recent months, which is also true. Again, doesn't take away from the fact there's many questions to be asked about prior measures, but nonetheless, that's a real positive. England's had one of the fastest growths in the G7, which the economy in a better position going into this next phase as the country begins to reopen. Now, of course, with these restrictions coming to an end, it wouldn't be true to the government's form if it was all gung-ho and move forward with positivity. There, of course, has to be a counterbalance. We couldn't watch a press conference where the Prime Minister is flanked by Sir Patrick Vallance and the recently knighted Sir Chris Whitty without some form of doom and gloom. And Chris Whitty brought a reasonable dose of that, talking about how it's important to recognise the pandemic isn't over and we must maintain contingencies. Whitty went on to show the usual slide decks, hospitalization still significant but declining. And seems to be in many ways actually in his positioning and his posturing that he's not quite on board with Boris's decision to move forward. Now, of course, the comments were around the vaccinations and the effectiveness of the vaccinations. I think the jury is out on the aggregate picture when it comes to wider harms. I think, again, that's another area where the safety data across different areas must be investigated. It's all very well signposting the effect on one singular virus, but if you're not comparing the outcomes, the safety outcomes and the wider ramifications, then it's not the full picture. I think there's a lot of work to do there. And of course, it wouldn't be a press conference if there was not a threat of a new variant around the corner, which of course you don't need to be a virologist or a scientist to recognize that viruses go through an evolutionary process, and it's almost inevitable that within time the Omicron variant will be replaced by another variant. And typically history shows at least that as COVID has done, the virus becomes weaker over times in terms of severity, but potentially more transmissible, and eventually will look more like the common cold. And in fact, many have already commented that the current variant is much more akin to a common cold. In fact, the Queen, at 95 years old, seems to be continuing to go about her business pretty nonchalantly, despite having COVID. So, hopefully that's a welcome sign to most people who've been living in fear that their dear old Queen, 95 years old, is just fine. There's plenty to be said about the rationale for these changes being absolutely bang on point around Omicron being much less severe. But this threat of new variants, of course, is real. There will likely be a new variant. There likely will be some hysteria around it. Again, we haven't quite let go. The title of this episode, Are We Ready to Let Go? It seems the world is not quite so ready to let go. And I think the thing to be more mindful of is the way in which the science community responds to any change, any genetic change in the virus. Now, of course, if there was, we're all reasonable people, if there was a genetic shift that made it deadly to a much wider population, then we would take it seriously. It's important to recognize that. But as it stands, logic would prevail that this is more likely to continue to get weaker and weaker in terms of its overall impact on health. Of course, they continue to reference how next winter could be a challenge. Well, we know that every winter is a challenge, particularly for the way we run the hospitals in England at full capacity. So nothing new there, nothing unexpected. But what is different is our mentality around how we tackle illness as we go along. So despite Boris's positive forward focus, Whitty brought a bit of a downer on it. He still encourages people to self-isolate, wear a mask, and all of those pieces of advice that they've maintained throughout the pandemic. And talked about the three things that will be remaining in place. Number one is the surveillance of new variants. Secondly, the capacity to scale up should they need to. And three, the ability to protect the vulnerable. Now, these things are actually reasonably sensible. It is sensible to look out for any particular thing that could affect us on a more broad scale or a more dangerous scale. It's also important to have preparations in place. We saw how we caught short big time the first time round, leading to this whole idea that we needed to flatten the curve, so to protect the NHS. So some level of provisions makes perfect sense. And ultimately, the important point is to protect the vulnerable, which is the most important point that we should have heeded right since the beginning, is understand the risk factors and do what we can to protect those most vulnerable members of society. But we've generally ignored that basic principle of public health for 2 years around the world, and I'm sure will be the focus of much scrutiny once we indeed do move past this and finally do let go. Vallance then took to the mic, Patrick Vallance, I should say, Sir Patrick Vallance to be even more polite, again reinforcing that the pandemic is not over and that the virus is continuing to evolve. Every variant is a new evolution and will continue to evolve rapidly over the next 2 years. There's no guarantee that the next variant will be less severe. Again, there is no guarantee, but history shows that it is more likely to continue to weaken. Reinforce the three measures of detection, respond and ramp up, and protecting the most vulnerable. And then use this analogy about how we should celebrate when the sun is shining, but continue to take our umbrella. Now, whilst there is some truth to that living in Britain, to our international audience who don't suffer the same weather predicament as us, it is somewhat futile advice. And actually, in some ways, that idea that we should always carry an umbrella just in case it rains is probably resemblant of the safety culture that we've emerged into over the last 2 years. it's taking a level of precaution that is over and above what we would normally see. It might seem innocuous, but when you start applying that to other areas of life, all of a sudden we live in this fear-based cotton wool society where we find it very difficult to move forward. And in this case, for those who are still vulnerable to this virus and other virus, of course, that's still a concern. And many of the points that are made about living with the virus leads people to feel vulnerable because of the way, as I've mentioned, that this whole thing has been treated over the last 2 years. But the reality is, when we talk about the elderly population, the immunosuppressed, the reality is, and we must not forget this, and whilst it's a hard fact to face, every winter the same holds true, whether it's influenza, cold, seasonal viruses, noroviruses. The hard truth is that the elderly, those with severe comorbidities, those who are obese, those who are immunosuppressed, are always going to be more vulnerable to any external pathogens, any circulating viruses or bacterial infections. That's a hard reality. And unfortunately, this culture that's emerged of shutting down the world is something that cannot be sustained. It simply cannot. And that's of course, I take very seriously those who are at risk still have to be precaution. They have to take precautions, and that's no different from year to year. But I think the way that this has been treated, COVID has been treated, has left people feeling differently about this particular respiratory virus versus others, which you can understand from the way it's been positioned. But I think it's time we start to look at how we truly protect the most vulnerable and also help them to be reassured so that they can live with the virus and get live their life. Because ultimately, I've spoken to many people in their 80s, 90s over the last 2 years, and they're just desperate to live their life, the final years of their lives and get on and enjoy themselves with their families. And if you are compromised, then life is precious to all of us. But to those who are at risk, well, life in some extent is even more precious. So it's important that we find a way to enable everyone to feel confident in the wake of this. Good news. Freedom Day is finally here. For the time being, as I mentioned, the perpetual threat of the new variants is always here. But let's just think more broadly now, give you a bit more analysis on the situation, because what's important to recognize is this, as I mentioned, is that actually England is one of the first to charge forward here. It's been typically unlike the Conservatives to follow this path that we've witnessed in terms of our the threats and compromise of our liberties and rights. That said, we should be very cautious about celebrating the role of the Conservatives in driving this forward, because although there have been some very outspoken voices across the COVID recovery group, the likes of Steve Baker, Mark Harper, and co., the reality is right now there are a number of bills coming through the House of Parliament, the online safety bill, the police bill, the human rights bill, which are entirely undemocratic and still threaten to harm our rights and liberties. So we can't place too much emphasis on the Conservative position in driving this forward and just in kind of looking at its relative position to history. We must also exhibit caution in the way that this Conservative Party in itself is driving these things forward. That said, the opposition, would I want the opposition in right now? Absolutely not. I'm completely politically homeless, and which is why it's down to us, the people, to continue to make sure that we put pressure on the politicians to do the right thing moving forward. I also think it's important to recognize the unprecedented, I hate using that word, but level of pressure that all governments have been facing, actually, from the public, the institutions, and the unions to actually continue to use restrictions. We covered this with Ben Irvine on the podcast, an analysis of the pressure that the unions have placed across the government over the last 2 years, really pushing for more restrictions. Early part of 2020, massive public petition, 400,000 plus people signed saying we need to lock down. This government has faced a relentless pressure from the public, institutions, and wider afield to actually maintain these restrictions. And this was evident in the media commentary tonight and also in the build-up to this. It's really important that people recognize the level of pressure the governments have been under. That doesn't mean that they can't operate independently and do so as they have done today and charge forward. But I think it's important to recognize the role that the public themselves have played, as well as the institutions and the unions. But as I mentioned, now for me, it's really, as we start to move forward from here, this is our golden opportunity to finally take stock of what has been happening over the last 2 years. Firstly, in the form of a public inquiry. Now, of course, I don't hold up any hope for the quality of a reasonable public inquiry in this country. The history has shown us they are time-consuming, they're cumbersome, they fail to come to any meaningful conclusion. That's why I think for our role as those of you who have been working alongside us as part of the activist community, it's really important that we continue now to work very, very closely to ensure that we push forward for a reasonable framework and put forward the relevant evidence for consideration within this public inquiry. But I do think it's also important that we pursue independent mechanisms of inquiry, both on a national and international means. And there are plans in place for that already unfolding, which is fantastic news. I'll be playing a big part in that. But it's really important that we do take stock. And we've seen this polarity of the people. We've seen this polarization amongst people over the last 2 years. People have really been divided over these issues. It's time that we begin to bridge that gap. And I think as we pursue, as we bring the evidence to the surface, people will start to see how all has not been as it seems for the last 2 years. We've obviously been covering it here on the Pandemic Podcast. We've reached over 15 million views, but that's a portion as a society. We haven't reached 15 million people. Lovely if we had, but it's important that we start to ask the big questions now, taking one eye on the rearview mirror and then another eye looking forward, because our greatest opportunity now is start to rebuild. Now the restrictions are over. It's important that we start to reimagine. And we continue to tackle the issues, as I mentioned, around the online safety bill, the Human Rights Act in this country. And I'm sure those of you who are watching from other parts of the world will also have the similar challenges. And of course, the UK's relaxation of the mandates itself is ahead of other nations. And we know that some are further behind. The issues in Canada are a testament to that. But we have seen many more restrictions start to fall in the recent weeks. Today, this week we've seen the mandates and passes dropping in places like Israel. Many provinces in Canada, due to the pressures, have started to drop their mandates. New Zealand is even admitting it's going to be unable to continue its lockdown and quarantine policies once they pass the peak of Omicron. Bulgaria's Prime Minister announced that the mandatory coronavirus green certification will no longer be required from the 20th of March. So we are seeing these restrictions starting to end around the world. And I think there is a level of unity that needs to emerge for those of us who are on the side of pushing to have these mandates removed. I think there's an opportunity for us now to lock arms on a global level to finish the job and to get over the finish line, to make sure that everyone becomes free off the back of this, and no one is free until we're all free. And then, as I mentioned, it's about reform, looking back what's happened over the last couple of years, and more importantly, start to reimagine the world that we want to live in the wake of COVID-19. There's a lot more I'd like to say tonight, but I want to kind of cap this as a short episode to give you a recap on what's been happening. But to summarize, if you've just joined us, great news. The restrictions are over, but there are plenty of battles out there still to be won on an international level. And also there are further threats to our democracy on the domestic front. And of course, until these restrictions and mandates are over all around the world, we're still restricted in some way. Freedom of movement is compromised, and we've got issues around the right to protest, the right to freedom of expression. There's a whole bunch of issues that are still facing us today. So it's a fascinating time to be alive. It's an exciting time to be alive, and for us, it is important to understand that what we've witnessed over the last 2 years is somewhat a reflection of an underlying trajectory that has underpinned this. And that comes with other challenges and threats to our liberties and rights, not exclusively, not exhaustively covering the points that I've mentioned tonight. There are, of course, the rise of new forms of technology, biosurveillance, nanotechnology. All of these different things play a role, or could play a role, in threatening our overall rights and liberties in the future. So, really, really important that we We recognize this, and really important that not only do we look in the rearview mirror to reevaluate and take stock and hold accountability where it's necessary, and justice where it's reasonably required, but importantly that we start to move forward with positive and courageous action, start to build resilient local communities, start to decentralize some of the power structures that hold all of the control. I think this is a unique decade in that we will really start to see a transformation in our culture and our society. And the most beautiful thing about this is we are the ones that are at the helm of shaping that. And I invite you to join us inside of our Elevate community. In fact, if you haven't recently joined us, we launched the Elevate Network. The Elevate Network is really forward focusing. It's about how do we elevate our consciousness? How do we transform ourselves in order to transform the world? We are going to start to bring, yes, we're going to continue the activism and help coordinating some of the campaigns that are out there and bringing those into the community. But more importantly, start to ask the questions about how we build a better tomorrow. And how we move forward to a new way of a new earth, as some people say it, or a new way forward, how we course correct from the trajectories we're on in order to make a brighter future for all of us and our children. So join us inside the Elevate Network. You can go to weareelevate.org. And plus, if you haven't joined our mailing list by now, where have you been 2 years in? Please just take a minute of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. That's danjgregory.com/pandemic. Join our mailing list. We'll keep you up to date with our interviews. We've got some fascinating conversations coming up about what's going on around the world. There's a lot more coverage to come from what's happening in Canada. And also, we'll start to take stock of really what's happened and make sense of what's happened in the last 2 years that's gone before us in terms of the political domain, the economic domain, the societal domain, human behaviors. It's really important that we continue to do that. So thank you so much for watching tonight. Thank you for sharing this, and look forward to seeing in our latest content this week. And if you do decide to join us inside of the Elevate Network, I look forward to seeing you there. We've got a community call this Wednesday night for our Elevate Circle, so look out for that. So good night for now. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again later this week. Peace for now.